So in understanding narcissistic rage,
the switch from the nice narcissist to the nasty narcissist is an example of splitting. Now, narcissistic rage is usually triggered by a very quick dip into a narcissistic wound. It's a very instantaneous compensatory mechanism that can happen by degrees. We can say that most every human has got some form of core narcissism and core narcissistic wound, and therefore a capacity towards some form at some time in some conditions to narcissistic rage. Now, this is a little bit different from pure anger. If someone has upset you, is arguing with you, it's not irrational to get angry back. It's an octave, so you've got anger that might go from 1 to 10, and then you've got the Richter scale that goes from 10 to 20, where the narcissistic rage is just exploding. We've got the 1 to 10, where somebody who's been hurt or cheated on in reality, like in a real relationship, is entitled in their own way to be hurt and enraged and disappointed and angry and upset. 1 to 10. Then you've got the narcissistic rage, humiliation, and the 1 to 10 there is the desire to react, to maybe hurt the other. If someone's been cheated on and they've maybe been with them and poured all their love into them, and this could be years, it could be children, their level of hurt and wounding is going to perhaps catalyze some feelings that they want the other to suffer also. Now, obviously, there's a matter of degree there, and this is not saying this is right. This is saying this is human, right? There is a level to which, if we get hurt and betrayed, that we are going to be angry and potentially want the other to suffer in some small way. Like, I wish it would happen to you. You'll get your comeuppance. Karma will get you. That's 0 to 10. Then you've got the narcissist wounding that feels entitled to wound from 10 to 100. Now, some narcissists won't. This is again, we're talking about personality disorder. We're talking about a toxic way of this manifesting. But the narcissist, when wounded, like the real narcissist, when feeling really wounded, and it might not even seem proportional, feels entitled to wound back an amplification of what they feel. Narcissists feel their own wounding very strongly. It's not that they are devoid of emotions. Absolutely not true. They have their own emotions that are easily triggered. We know that when a narcissist gets very upset, they go to borderline. They go to more of a chaotic, acting out kind of behavior. So while, and of course, anyone with any one of these personality disorders or characteristics has also got their own different cocktail flavor mix of this. So it's hard to generalize, very hard to generalize. But when a narcissist feels wounded, we don't really often understand why it has been so triggering and wounding, because the pain is within them, and what we experience is the lashing out and the retribution and the punishment and the violence and the need to name and shame. What we do know is that the narcissist or the borderline or the person with a personality disorder doesn't have a firm sense of their own inner identity. There isn't necessarily a core self. Now, in psychoanalytic literature, this used to be referred to as the schizoid core, meaning that there was a schism inside. There was nothing in there. There was this hollowness within the individual. And so the narcissist we can see as forming in a way where the individual, when they were very, very little, surrendered the idea of having a core identity. And by saying they surrendered it, it meant that over a particular developmental phase, which could have been years, the gratification that the child got from either engaging in an idealized fantasy of who they were and engaging with others from that idealized fantasy that allowed them to get this buffer against feeling this impoverished aloneness or this deep shame or this sense that nobody was there. So in this narcissist or this personality disordered relationship style, in the lack of having this core sense of self, this core identity, instead having a sort of a vacuum within self, the child may have had to default to the strategy of having these idealized self in relationship with others, as opposed to being able to develop and consolidate a core identity and sense of self. But you will have something within the individual that may provide a scaffold to go in either direction. Most of the time, we understand that a narcissist or a borderline or a personality disorder is developed under extreme forms of relational distress and trauma. This can be true. Also, we have the inverse where there is potentially a more narcissistically oriented parent who is having a grandiose relationship with their child, where the child is elevated to a status which isn't real for them. And so because it's not a reality, they need to act into this ideal that the parent may hold for them. And this is where you've got more of a smothered, overcompensating, idealized child as opposed to a relationally stressed or traumatized child. So both can lead to a narcissistic personality type. Obviously, there's all different variations, shapes, forms of narcissistic personality type, because in there is also a human with their own temperament and their own individual capacities and personality. But what hasn't formed is a core sense of self. And this is why working with narcissistic personality disorder is so very difficult, because there isn't anything to contain or reflect back in on these behaviors. The identifications are the self. And so what this means is that the narcissistic personality in its extreme or absolute form is a set of idealized identifications of an image of self that needs others to reflect it back. And this is what we mean by narcissistic supply. It literally supplies the narcissist's identity, their idealized self-image, as I framed it. And that's how a narcissist will continue to survive and exist. And so there's no core self. It's almost like a vacuum, because it hasn't developed somewhere along the line. There has been more of an inclination towards having an idealized self that might interact with others in reality or in one's own imagination and mindscape. Because remember, the narcissist has a grandiose fantasy of self in some way, shape, or form. And that could be a negative grandiosity, meaning the vulnerable narcissist who identifies himself as being the greatest victim, the grandiose narcissist who identifies himself as being the greatest person, or all the other different variations, which I won't go into. And this may come from more of a trauma response or a predilection towards favoring that strategy, or that strategy is elicited and the reward for the child or toddler or preschool or whatever is greater by moving into this idealism. And then you've got the one that is created by being idealized by the parent, the little prince or princess or that cannot do any wrong, that has all these magnificent talents. Now, even there, I don't want parents to start worrying that by giving their child a lot of support and encouragement and telling them they're great is going to create their child into being a narcissist, although it may encourage those narcissistic characteristics to emerge a little bit more so. But in this, the narcissist personality that might be created by being adored as a small child, there's a lack of connection with the reality of what that child actually feels, but they don't tend toward developing that inner core of, oh, I don't know if that's quite true, if I'm quite that magnificent. They rather tend towards buying into it, because in the person who's developed unnarcissistically, can we make that a term? You have got an unnarcissistic personality, undisorder, not disordered, there is a core sense of self. Now, this core sense of self can be toned by negativity or devaluation of self, and the act of self-reflection requires some form of core identity to reflect back in on self. This is difficult, nigh impossible for the personality disordered types. Cluster B personality types have a great amount of difficulty reflecting back in on self in a realistic way that will encourage further growth and development. Because we can see that a vulnerable narcissist might forever be putting themselves down. And we might think, oh, look at them. You know, they're so down on themselves. They're so full of shame and guilt. They must have self-awareness. Do they? Or are they getting a supply from bouncing this self-deriding image off other people back in onto themselves so that they can become the most supreme long-suffering victim? You know, they might be getting their supply from that idea, from that self-image and identity, and how we can see where this might differentiate someone with a self-depreciating way and style of being in the world from someone who's actually more of a vulnerable narcissist is the capacity to do something and to grow and to move forward with that information or with that self-reflection or with that self-identity.